Hello, everybody. It's good to be here with AFT. I'm glad to be here today with Randy and Loretta, Delisa, and all of my friends. I thank you for welcoming Yara and Sauda and Claude, who led us in song. The truth of the matter is that AFT has been with the Forward Together moral movement from the beginning. And when you see that mass of people marching together and staying together, we could not have done it without your support. And I'm here today, Randy, to say thank you. Loretta, to say thank you. I bring you greetings from the North Carolina NAACP and the Forward Together moral movement down south in North Carolina, where we're fighting hard against a fresh expression of extremism. And we are declaring that we will go forward together and not take one step back. We left fresh from the battlefield on late last night, so I say to the sound man, just help me a little bit. My voice is a little tired getting off. I'm an old country boy. About all this flying is different for me. But we are there. And I want to talk to you about where this determination for me and others not to go backwards comes from. First of all, it is rooted in my spiritual reality and faith. Hebrews chapter 10 says, verse 39, we are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul, for faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. But it's also rooted in my social and historical reality through which I view the world. 51 years ago, when I was born, this nation was in a moral crisis. There was governors whose lips were dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, defying the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, defying the Brown versus Board of Education decision. They were stuck, along with their immoral allies, in the attitudes of racism and classism, and had no shame. One of them even declared, who was their spokesman, in the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. In that moment, those who wanted to move forward, those who believed in justice, were called outside agitators, Randy. During that time, violence accompanied this moral crisis. Mega was killed. Children were blown up in churches for simply wanting to go to integrated schools. And even a president who was no raving liberal was killed in part because he was being moved to do the right thing. It was a moral crisis. But in that moment, the devotees of justice and freedom did not shrink back. They did not have the money that meanness had. They did not have the political votes. They did not have the majority of public opinion, but they did not shrink back. They marched, they organized, they built coalitions, they rallied young people, they engaged in civil disobedience, they lobbied, they turned moments of despair into movements of hope. They came together. They lifted up their moral and religious principles of justice and love and fairness. My parents, public educators, Loretta, were a part of that generation. They declared what Hebrews 10 says, and I like it in the Message Bible, where it also says, but we are not quitters who lose out. Oh no, we will stay with it and we will survive, trusting all the way. After the March on Washington, my parents chose to answer the call to come back to the South, where my father was from, to fight for equality and desegregation in public education. Now, I was born 2 days after the march, and the joke in my family is my mother went into labor on the 28th, but since some of you all with gray hair were marching, I decided to wait and see what was going to happen. And then I was born on August the 30th. But my parents saw this 11 years after Brown Schools were still not desegregated in the South, and it would be for another 8 years, 1971, after the Swan case litigated by Julius Chambers. But my parents and that generation, they didn't quit. My parents sacrificed. They could have stayed in North, stayed in Indianapolis. They were doing quite well, but they came back to the South. When they came back to the South, my mother was a business graduate. My father had 2 master's degrees, earning a doctorate degree, and didn't have protected voting rights, but they didn't quit. The Voting Rights Act was not passed until 1965, but they came back to fight anyhow. They came back to join the moral crusade that changed the nation and the world. And my mother, who is 81 years old today, not today, but this year, is still working in the school that she desegregated in 1971. My mother, I asked her sometime, why are you still working? She said, when I first came here, they didn't want me here. Now I'm going to stay till I want to leave. That generation, they changed the immoral realities of racism and classism and the sins of injustice. They worked to change the world because they would not turn back and they would not quit. Well, I want to say today we can't turn back either. I want to suggest today that we are in a moral crisis that demands that we have a movement now. And I've seen and I believe that deep within our being is a longing for a true moral compass. For those of us who are moved by the cries of our brothers and sisters, we know that like justice, the acts of caring for the vulnerable and embracing the stranger and healing the sick and educating our children and protecting workers and welcoming and being fair to all members of the human family can never be relegated to the margins of our social consciousness or to the margins of our political debate. I'm so sick of a limited moral discussion that the so-called religious right wants to purport to suggest that the only moral issues are abortion, prayer in the school, and homosexuality. I'm so bothered by that because most of what they purport only has about 5 scriptures that support it, and 4 of them they misinterpret. I'm so bothered because I am a person of faith, a biblical person, and I have a Bible that I carry with me called the Poverty and Justice Bible, and in that Bible it has more than 2,000 scriptures that speak to the issue of justice and fairness and love and how you care for the least of these. So I'm here to say, and you ought to join me in saying, that those that claim they want a real moral debate in America, well, baby, you bring it on because the time is right now. We need a conversation that understands that some issues are not just policy issues. They're not left versus right issues. They are the centerpiece of our deepest tradition of our faith, our values, and our sense of morality and what is right. They are the moral center. And we must remind those who make decisions regarding public policy what Isaiah said. Randy, your rabbi would agree with this, where Isaiah said, where is she? Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make children and women their prey. We need a conversation that says what William Lloyd Garrison said back in the South during the days of slavery when he was an abolitionist. He says, I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. And on this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write in moderation. He said, go tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell a wife to moderately rescue her children from the fire. But don't urge me to be moderate in the cause like the present. He said, when it comes to justice, when it comes to what is right, I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard. We need a moral discussion. We need a discussion that says, like Dorothy Day, the co-founder of the Catholic Workers Movement, where are the saints, she asked, that change the social order in such a way that we don't just remedy evil, but we avoid evil in the first place when it comes to how we treat people. There is a longing, I believe, for the kind of critique that reminds us of what Dr. King said 46 years ago in one of his last sermons. He said, if you ignore the poor, ignore health care and education and living wages, one day the whole system will collapse and implode. The costs are too high. Touch your neighbor and say, the costs are too high. If we don't address systemic racism and extremism and poverty, it costs us the soul of our nation. Every time we fail to educate a child on the front end of life, it costs us on the backside of life. Every time. Every time those in our nations attack teachers and undermine public education, it rips not only the nation's economy, but it rips at the very integrity of who we are as a nation. Every time. Every time we deny living wages and leave whole communities impoverished, it costs us the very soul of who we are. Every time we fail to provide health care on the front side of life, it costs us on the back side of life. Every time we attempt to suppress the right to vote, it tears at the heart of our democracy and the necessary foundation to establish justice. Somebody must raise this cry. Especially when you have political extremists called by whatever name they want to call themselves, Tea Party, ultra-conservative, Coke money puppets, feeding the public with an immoral agenda. And you know, I've summed that agenda up, Loretta. It's really not that deep, but it's quite dangerous. They say, this is their whole agenda, that the best way to have a better America is to deny public education, attack teachers, attack tenure, attack assistance and support systems, and take public school money and give it to private school. They say the best way to having a better America is to deny health care and Medicaid expansion and leave millions of poor people uninsured. They say the best way to have a better America is to undermine earned income tax credit that even Ronald Reagan supported. And anytime you can make Ronald Reagan look like a liberal, you really have some issues. They say deny unemployment. They say deny labor rights. They say deny LGBT rights. They say deny women's rights. They say deny immigrants' rights and hold vicious rallies against immigrant children. And that gets us a better America. They say cut more taxes for the wealthy and then declare that you don't have money for critical investments. That's what they say. And then they say if you really want a great America, when you know your agenda can't survive if America really votes, then what you do is you engage in the worst forms of voter suppression since Jim Crow. And then they say if you really want a great America, and to have a great nation, tell every lie you can about the president, call him everything but an American. If you really want a great America, refuse to pass anything just because you don't like him. Fight even his wife when she wants children to eat vegetables. And if you really want a great America, then after you have flamed all the fires of racial and class and national hatred, make sure everybody gets a gun and that getting a gun is easier to vote. That kind of agenda makes no sense. That kind of agenda is immoral. This is. And somebody must stand up and speak up and say, this is an immoral agenda. It's contrary to our deepest faith values. It's contrary to the requirement that we love the least of these. It's contrary to the demands that we lift up workers and hold teachers in high regard and heal the sick and care for the brokenhearted. It's contrary, the ultimate requirement of God, that we do justice and love mercy and walk humbly. It's contrary to the call to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And it is contrary to that eternal question that hounds us every day of our life. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? But not only is this extreme agenda contrary to our greatest faith values, it's contrary, Randy, to the promises of America. In America, where we are, sometimes I wonder where they are, but in America, where we are, we promise that the government of the people, by the people, shall never fade from the face of the earth. We promise in this country equal protection under the law. We promise we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We promise, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. We promise one nation. Not a Tea Party nation or a Koch brother nation, but one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And anytime extremists set a course of attack against these values and these promises, we are in a moral crisis. And in fact, in American history, this crisis arises again and again. America has this strange reality of going forward, lurching forward, and then falling backwards. In the 1800s, right after slavery, blacks and whites came together, formed what we call Fusion Coalition. You know what their agenda was 146 years ago? Voting rights, constitutional public education, fair wages, fair tax policies, fair criminal justice system, and fair representation. And where I came from 146 years ago, blacks and whites came together all over the South and changed it. But then the extremists couldn't stand it. They couldn't stand this kind of moral progress, so they began an immoral campaign of deconstruction. They used fear and division and political trickery, and they undermined it. Then again, in the mid-1900s, America resets her moral compass. Supreme Court changes. Plessy versus Ferguson. A fusion is born among blacks, whites, trade unionists, Latinos, young people, women. You get the March on Washington, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, War on Poverty, changes in Social Security, targeted economic development. Again, extremists couldn't stand this kind of moral movement in the nation, so they began an immoral campaign of deconstruction, came up with something called the White Southern Strategy. They used fear and division, both in the South and in the suburbs of the North. And they began to turn back through attacks on voting rights and violence against progressive leaders. And then Dr. King was shot. Then the movement imploded. Then in 1974, according to a recent article, the extremists went all in. Charles Koch said it like this. He said in 1974, let's don't invest in political candidates. Let's invest in infrastructure and mechanisms to feed our agenda 24/7. And the author of the article says progressives chose to let go of the moral arguments. The progressives instead chose to let go of the moral arguments and invest in messiah candidates. But as soon as the campaigns were over, the structure was gone. But the extremists decided to take over the moral arguments and to invest in infrastructure. And because of this, the extremists have built a movement from our own playbook. They have built a movement from the bottom up. They have changed the moral categories to be limited to those three I mentioned: abortion, prayer in the school, and homosexuality. But then that same article a few weeks ago concludes, it is not, listen to me, that extremism is so strong, but that those who know we need a progressive moral agenda are so unorganized. Hear me now. And the problem is, in this moral crisis, too often we overestimate their power and underestimate our own power. That's why I love your theme, Reclaiming the Promise, because we should declare today that this reality is over, and we should make America a fresh promise of our own, and that is that we will organize and we will fight for the soul of our democracy. It's time. We must unpack the greatest myth of our time, and that is the notion that extreme policies only hurt a small subset of people, such as people of color, or gay people, or women, or poor people. Extremism hurts us all. And I'm here to tell you, down in North Carolina, we've seen greedy, wealthy extremists playing on the fears of working class white people, pushing a moral agenda. We've seen ultra-conservative extremist politicians and their financial backers adopt a divide and conquer strategy, intentionally causing many people to vote against their own interests. And they won temporarily. Oh, but in the midst of it, I'm so glad there's a scripture that says that what men mean for evil. Do I have a witness out there? God has a way of turning the good. And in the midst of all this, we have seen the power of building what you saw on the screen, an indigenously homegrown led, state-based, state government-focused, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-education, pro-labor, transformative fusion movement. We have seen the power of picking up the plow of justice and equality one more time. We have seen the power of getting people to understand the intersectionality and the connectivity between our issues. We have seen the power of building an agenda based on hope and not fear. We have seen the power of taking on extremism on moral terms. And so we've come up with a moral agenda. That agenda has 5 points. Because I thought about to say, teachers, you can't just be concerned about education, because the people fighting you are not just concerned about education. See, the same people fighting you are the same people fighting against voting rights. Same people fighting voting rights are the same people fighting women's rights. The same people fighting women's rights are the same people fighting immigrant rights. Same people fighting immigrants' rights are the same people fighting labor rights. So you and I must be smart enough to hook up. Touch your neighbor and say, we need a hookup. Yeah. And this is how you hook up. You can't hook up with just a personality, because personalities come and go. But you hook up with an agenda. And you don't wait for somebody from D.C. to come save your state. You got to rise up in North Carolina, rise up in South Carolina, rise up in Minnesota, rise up in Georgia, rise up in Virginia, rise up in Maryland, rise up in Florida, rise up! Yeah. Give me a few minutes and I'm through. This is how you rise up. We believe this agenda gives us a hookup. First, a pro-labor, anti-poverty policy that create economic sustainability by fighting for employment and living wages and the alleviation of disparate unemployment and a green economy and labor rights and affordable housing and targeted empowerment zones and development banks and strong safety net services for the poor and fair policies for immigrants and infrastructure development and fair tax reform. That's one. Number 2, educational equality by ensuring every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education with access to community colleges and universities and supporting teachers and the assistance to teachers and the infrastructure for education. Number 3, health care for all by assuring access to the Affordable Care Act, Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, and providing environmental protection. Number 4, fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities in the system that hurt black and brown and poor white people. And then number 5, we must hook up by protecting and expanding voting rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, immigrants' rights, and we must hold on to the fundamental promise of equal protection under the law. With this agenda, we can build fusion coalitions that are not just drawn because of a personality, but we are hooked together because of our principles of hope. What have we seen with this agenda? With this agenda, building on 7 years of working together, Loretta, we've now been at this 62 straight weeks with Moral Monday, 120 actions. With this agenda, we've seen 1,004 people get arrested in the State House for civil disobedience because of our legislature, more than any time in the history of this country. With this agenda, Randy came and marched in the front of the line with me when 80,000 people showed up in Raleigh in the dead of winter, the biggest march since Selma in 1965. With this agenda, we've seen young people engaged like never before. With this agenda, we now have 50 young people organizing in 50 counties, registering 50,000 new registered voters in the next 10 weeks. With this agenda, we've seen 1,000 clergy come together of all different faiths. With this agenda, labor unions and civil rights and women groups and LGBT groups and immigrant groups and environmentalists are working together like never before. With this agenda, we have made a state movement a national issue. With this agenda, we've seen the Moral Monday campaign break out in 9 other states and are growing. With this agenda, when we started, the governor was at 50%, but after 62 weeks, he's under 30% in the polls and dropping. With this moral agenda, when we started, the extremist legislature were at 40% in the poll. Last week, the poll said they are at 18% and falling. With this agenda, most of our items, Loretta, when we started, we were under 50%. But after 2 weeks of this transforming, interconnected agenda, refusing to give up just because the polls weren't with us, we've now shifted the center of political gravity. And according to the polls, now 61% disagree with using public school money for vouchers in North Carolina. Now, after 62 weeks, 58% of North Carolinians would rather raise taxes and give teachers a pay raise. Now, 58% of the people believe we should expand Medicaid. Now, 55% of North Carolinians oppose a tax plan that gives money to the wealthy while you take money from public education. If you hang in there, now, 68% of North Carolinians disagree with our state's monster voter suppression laws that have cut early voting and tried to dismantle the opportunity to vote. We are showing people that there is higher ground. And I came by to share it with you in this moral crisis. We need a moral movement, not a Democratic movement or Republican movement, or a liberal movement or a conservative movement, but a moral movement that says some issues are constitutionally inconsistent, they are morally indefensible, and they are economically insane. We need a moral movement that puts a face on the pain that is caused by extremism. We need a moral movement that says we cannot allow ourselves or this nation to wallow in the valley of injustice. Our politics can reach higher ground. Higher ground. Our politics can be kind and loving and just and fair. Higher ground where children are educated, Michael. Higher ground where people are loving. Michael and I talked about this long ago before things went national. He had me come up to New York. We talked about the power of all of us being together. We have seen with this kind of agenda, we can now go into Mitchell County. Mitchell County is 99% white and 89% Republican. But guess what? We're now organizing in Mitchell County. The Mitchell County chair of the Republican Party renounced the extremism in his own party and denounced his chairmanship and said, I'm not with that kind of program when you start messing with public education. 1920, they ran all the black folk out of Mitchell County. In 2014, we just formed the most interracial new branch of the NAACP in Mitchell County. 4 weeks ago, a 9-generation Republican teacher stood at our educational rally on Moral Monday and called the extremists in her own party stupid for attacking public education. I'm telling you, this works. With a moral agenda, we now have a Republican mayor named Adam O'Neill who has joined our call for Medicaid expansion. And on Monday, he's going to begin a 350-mile walk to D.C. to challenge the folk of his own party to stop blocking Medicaid expansion at the state level. We have seen the power of when we mobilize in the streets, say streets, polls, the halls of the legislature, and in the courtroom. And that's why, as I conclude, we are now calling on every southern state. You have to do it in your own state. We can't lead it, but we can inspire it. We're calling on every other southern state and other states where the extremists in your state capital are trying to turn things back to join us from August the 21st to the 28th for 7 straight days of action, all at the same time. What if we could get together and stand together for 7 straight days? What if we would march on state capitals for 7 straight days? What if we would take over the national media with our agenda for 7 straight days? What if we would say, never again will the forces of good be disorganized in this nation? And so I stopped by to tell you, it's time to make America a fresh promise. And Randy, that promise is, when anybody, no matter how much spiked tea they have drank, no matter how much lewd money they have taken, no matter how much coke, K-O-C-H, they have sniffed, no matter how many voting roadblocks they have put up, no matter how many judges they buy and place on the court, we make America this promise. We will organize together. We will fight together. We will pray together. We will go to court together. We will stand together. We will mobilize together. We will vote together. We will raise our moral voices together, and we will fight for the soul of this nation. And together, we will challenge anybody who tries to tear us apart. Those who want us to be quiet, if they didn't know, they better ask somebody. The Bible says when there's a moral crisis, somebody must cry loud and spare not. Somebody must even do what Bob Marley said, get up, stand up for your rights. Somebody must do what Bishop Tutu said, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has his foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. We got to say with Mahatma Gandhi, silence becomes cowardice when the occasion demands that speaking the whole truth and acting accordingly is the order of the day. And I know the power of staying together. I know it biblically. Can I close by preaching a little bit? Help me, Lord. I know the power of staying together, because when Moses, his people, and that rod got together, Pharaoh had to come down, and the Red Sea had to open up. Do I have a witness here? When Esther and her uncle Mordecai stayed together, they were able to stop the plots and the destruction against the Jewish people. When David and his rock and his slingshot and his faith got together on a battlefield, Goliath fell, and the headline in the Jerusalem newspaper the next morning was, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. Oh, help me, Lord. When Shadrach, Meshach, and that bad Negro stayed together, way down in the fiery furnace. Then God cooled the fire down. When the disciples stayed together in an upper room, then God poured out the Holy Spirit and gave them power. So I know what staying together does biblically, but I also know what staying together does historically. Truth is, when you hold on to the truth, justice has never lost. I didn't say justice didn't get fought. I didn't say justice doesn't get beat up, but justice has never lost. Slavery looked like justice had lost. But when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists, when they all got together, they beat back slavery. Women didn't have the right to vote. But when Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Canton Staton got together, they won the right for women. Plessy versus Ferguson looked like it had the victory. But when Thurgood Marshall got white lawyers and black lawyers and Jewish lawyers, and they got together, an all-white Supreme Court where one member used to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan voted unanimously to tear down separate but equal. Looked like Jim Crow had beaten down justice and couldn't rise again. But when Rosa Parks and Martin King and Bayard Rustin and Viola Russo and Swanna Channing Goodman and thousands of others got together, they tore down Jim Crow and put Jim Crow in the bread. So I know it biblically, and I know it historically. And don't you know why they are attacking you so? If they have to stack the Supreme Court, if they have to unleash pornographic sums of money, if they have to do all that to win, then their plots actually prove your power. You better hear what I'm saying as I go to my seat. Touch your neighbor. Say, neighbor, if they've got to fight us this hard, we must be some bad somebody. Y'all don't hear what I'm saying. I'm going to my seat. Yeah. That's why. Oh, Lord, help me here. That's why I believe that I heard 93-year-old Rosanelle Eaton, who's been through Klan violence and hatred, when we went into federal court this week to challenge the voter suppression law, while they were patting her down, and the federal officers were looking to see if Rosanelle Eaton had a gun. She said, I don't need no gun. And I heard her singing, ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. She didn't say me for that time. She said us, because she understands the power of our togetherness. So I know it biblically, when we get together, we win. I know it historically when we get together. But let me close by saying I know it personally. A few years ago, Randy, I don't talk about this too often, some said I'd never walk again. They said I might never be out of a wheelchair for the rest of my life. It tore me open at 30. I was 30 years old and I had always depended on my legs. I was 30 years old and my legs always carried me where I wanted them to go. But one morning, my legs stopped working. And for 12 years, I was on a walker and in a wheelchair. For 12 years, every morning I got up and it felt like somebody had a butcher knife in my left hip, killing me at 12 years. But then over those 12 years, it's funny how the Lord works, my mind got together. My mind got together. Then my doctors got together. Then my therapists got together. Then my body got together. Then my prayer warriors got together. Then my swim coach got together. And when they all got together, when they all got together, when they all got together, and I'm a witness, when AFT and the NAACP gets together when a Jewish lady and a black woman and a Southern preacher get together, when the teachers and the environmentalists and the healthcare workers and the women's rights and the LGBT and the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians and those with faith and those that don't have faith, but they believe in a moral universe, when we all get together, what a day! 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 Make America one promise. Here we come, and we're coming together!